Tonight, the life and times of Farley Mowat. The boy who preferred talking to animals turns his passion into popular and controversial books. Good evening, I'm Gordon Pinsent. Farley Mowat, author, traveler, activist, a man who all of his life has been deeply emotionally involved in sensitive environmental issues. He's made a home for himself on the best-selling list, and favorites like Never Cry Wolf and The Dog Who Wouldn't Be are often required reading in the classrooms of our country. Farley Mowat forged a life's work from his natural-born love of animals and the environment. He calls himself a naturalist observer who turned into a collector of scientific facts. Facts which, as critics say, have been colored by his love of fiction.
Farley Mowat. There's a herd animal, he tries to take care of it.
Farley Mowat's a sort of wild, eccentric person who would do anything to learn more about nature and how animals live. According to one of his books, Farley Mowat ate mice.
Oh.
Prophet, storyteller, and lover of everything that God ever created.
That's a girl, I'm coming.
Like an actor. He puts on a sort of mask and a persona.
Never let the facts interfere with the truth.
Fact or non-fact. He sort of mixes them. I think that's wrong.
They can't change the fact that he's the best writer Canada's ever known.
At 75, Farley Mowat is working on his 35th book. He's been thinking about this one for more than 30 years, since his controversial book about the Vikings.
Over the years, the research has led me through very convoluted ways to the discovery of a people who've been forgotten. They've vanished out of time.
The Albans, he says, reached North America even before the Vikings. The Albans?
It's going to be an enormous book, and it's going to infuriate every single historian who's ever dealt with the migrations of northern peoples. It's going to get me into absolute shit, if you'll pardon the phrase.
Mowat's books have sold 18 million copies in 24 languages. He calls himself a socialist and a Canadian nationalist. He's become a cultural icon.
What you are about to hear is the legend of how Farley Mowat ate my brother.
Mowat says he writes subjective nonfiction, truthful but not slavishly factual. Even as a boy, he was more interested in the story than the details.
Farley always exaggerated, you know that.
His father Angus was a strong-willed individualist and a storyteller too. He told lurid tales about his only son's conception, tales which his wife Helen denied. We do know that Farley was eventually born in Belleville, but his restless father soon moved on.
Or lost the use of an arm in the First World War. And he had to be outdoors. The family tried to find him a job, which they did, as a clerk clerk in a tea company owned by another member of the family. And of course, he lasted there about 3 weeks, and then they fired him. They had to, because he was intractable. He did not submit easily to the stupidities of bureaucracy, a characteristic which I have fortunately inherited from him.
Angus Mowat loved books and became a librarian, first in Trenton, then Belleville, Windsor, Saskatoon, Toronto. Young Farley moved 8 times in his first 19 years. He never really belonged anywhere.
I've never been socially malleable. I don't meld well. In my younger years, there was a simple physiological reason. I was a little sawed-off squirt.
His name was always a target for juvenile humor.
It was obviously Farley everywhere I went. And so when we moved to Saskatoon, I went to school on my own. I was 12, I think, and I registered as I chose to be known thereafter. And I remember bringing back my first report card, and my father looked at it and saying, "Who the hell is William Mowat?" I said, "It's me, Daddy." I had changed it to William, and I was Billy the whole time I was in Saskatoon. Chameleon.
Chameleon. Young Farley found his friends in the forests and in the prairie sloughs.
He seemed to like his animals just, well, better than human beings almost.
Following his father's example, he kept detailed diaries and found he loved to write. He broke into print as a nature columnist for the Saskatoon Star-Phoenix at the age of 14.
A way of alleviating your loneliness. It gives you a sense of, not superiority, but a sense of purpose in a world where everybody else is playing hockey. I could do something that they couldn't do.
His companions were the 2 ferocious owls, Wall and Weeps. Closest of all was his dog, the inimitable, immortal Mutt.
I had left a ladder leaning against the side of a house for some reason, or somebody had left it. And Mutt loved ladders. He saw this ladder and climbed up, and it opened into somebody's second-floor bedroom. And there were a couple in it, enjoying the moment of peace and leisure and a little romance. And they looked up, and here was a strange black face peering at them through the window. And the woman screamed, and the guy rushed to the window, and Mutt fell off the ladder. He wasn't seriously injured by this, but his dignity was. He looked hurt. And it occurred to me, it didn't occur to me, it was obvious. This dog's emotions were about the same as mine. And I understood then, I guess, that he and I were one.
Farley's father would talk to Mutt and essentially tell him stories and talk to him about himself and what a wonderful dog he was and what a brave dog he was and what a great hunter. What a great protection he was to their home and so on.
There's always been a dog in the Mowat household. As his vision of human life steadily darkened, the dogs became ever more important.
It's because dogs became, or were, the conduit that connected me first and forever after with the rest of animate creation. They were the window out of the box that mankind has built for himself.
In Saskatchewan, Angus took Farley hunting just once.
As the dawn came, the sky filled with wings, birds' wings, the sound of flock after flock of ducks and geese. Both of us stood up together, and we blazed away at these ghostly shapes. It was not a conscious act, actually. It was a subconscious thing. And when the smoke had cleared, the geese were gone, except for one lone goose, a snow goose, pure white black wingtips. And it came down, spiraled down, hit the water, and it was only injured, broken wing, and it swam away from us. It swam away into the snowy distance. And I suppose that I never forgave myself.
The young writer put his sorrow on the page.
A ring of feathers scattered round, a quivering pulp of flesh and bone, a pool of blood on the autumn ground.
A pool of blood on the autumn ground. A life has passed to the great unknown.
By 1939, the Mowats were back in Ontario. War was coming, an experience which would change Mowat profoundly.
I think Farley the writer is a a very different person. I think he went through this a tremendous change in his life during the war.
There was never any question that Farley would join his father's regiment, the Hastings and Prince Edwards, the Hasty Peas as they were known. By 1943, the Hasty Peas were fighting northward in Italy. Among them was a boyish-looking Lieutenant Farley Mowat.
I was parading people in and out. So I said to the adjutant, "You got two sickly-looking officers. Get them the hell out of there." And he said, "Yeah, that's Farley Mowat." And I thought, Angus Mowat's son?
The Canadian 1st Division took terrible casualties in Italy, slowly driving the Germans back across strongly defended rivers and lines of fortification.
He did it for a long time, you know, like a platoon commander. Life expectancy wasn't too long. You know, if you look at the list of dead out there, you'll see lieutenant, 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 lieutenants. And that's because they had a lead right up. Farley Mowat was a good officer, a good leader. He could think in battle.
Artillery bombardments, tank engagements. The Hasty Peas didn't often actually see the enemy. But once, Mowat dived for shelter and found himself face to face with a wounded German soldier.
He was alive, but he'd been pretty well cut in half. His liver was hanging right out, and he was a goner. And nobody could do anything for him, and the shell fire was intense. I didn't dare go out of this. It was an old ruined Italian house. But I had, my water bottle was full of rum. That was what kept me going for the last part of my active action period. I used to steal rum and fill my water bottle. And I'd been nipping at it, and this guy kept saying, "Wasser, Wasser, give a Wasser." Whew, it was a hard one. And I had no water. And I thought, well, he's dying anyway. So I give him my water bottle. And he shaking hands, pouring down his face. And he got enough of it into him to, I guess, maybe still the pain or anesthetize himself. And then he just sort of put down the water bottle and died.
By now, the real enemy was mental breakdown, what Mowat calls the worm within. One day, his best friend deliberately walked into a storm of German bullets. To hold the worm at bay, Farley's mind fled back to innocent Saskatchewan, to the animal world, and to writing.
When things got absolutely intolerable, at Ortona it was, and I was just hanging on to my sanity by a thread, I had to escape. So I escaped back into my childhood and started to write what eventually became The Dog Who Wouldn't Be. And again, there is a debt that I owe to a dog. That the sanity that one finds in the lives of other animals, and which mankind has deprived himself of. We live in a state of constant insanity, although we don't admit it. But the sanity of dogs was enough to help restore mine, and it gave me a new grip on life.
It would be 35 years before he could write about war, but the horror of it had changed him forever.
I guess even up to that point, I still had a fairly high opinion of my own species. It wasn't until I had recapitulated the war experience that I understood how deeply flawed we are and how incredibly dangerous, not just to ourselves, but to the world at large. And after that, I began to look much more closely at what we were doing to the rest of the world.
There are no kangaroos here in Cape Breton Island, where Mowat spends half of every year. But the kangaroo is an impish reminder that this chronicler of nomads and wanderers remains something of a nomad himself.
bills, hydro bills, Nova Scotia power bills. There's another one. I'm not even going to open that.
No computers, no fax machines, and the mail is not electronic.
But never mind.
It's the thought that counts.
Where the hell would this come from?
Why is that?
I get an awful lot of mail from young people. I get, maybe 7 or 8 letters a day. And of course, when school's in, I get letters come in like a mountain avalanche. Because teachers have long since learned that the easiest way to get the kids to do something and teach English or whatever is say, now today we're going to write a letter to an author. And some people might consider it a misfortune. I consider it a blessing.
Mowat came back from the war in 1946. Again, he turned to animals. He enrolled in biology at the University of Toronto. In the lab, he met Frances Thornhill. They married the next year.
My mother loved him. I often thought she should have married him. You know, not her charmer. So was Angus.
As a student, Mowat made several trips to the Arctic Barrens. He went first with a government expedition to study wolves and their impact on the caribou herds. The Arctic and its people seized his imagination. He went north as a budding scientist. He returned a budding writer.
I'd become deeply involved in what was happening to the native people who were intimately involved with the caribou. To me, it was all one story. And I'd become enraged and infuriated by the neglect of the Barrenland Eskimos and of the Northern Indians, who were the caribou people. And I'd started sending long radiograms to my superior in the biology department or the wildlife department in Ottawa, saying we must do something about these people, they're dying and so on. And I kept getting back very short radiograms saying, this is not your goddamn business. And I refused to accept this. And finally I sent a radiogram from Brochy just after Christmas of 1947, saying it is imperative that we act immediately or the people, the Eskimos of the Central Barrens, will not survive the winter. They need help right now. And it was a long radiogram, 500 words, and went collect, because I couldn't pay for these things. It went through an Army signal station. And I got back a 3-word prepaid radiogram 2 days later. It said, "You are fired."
Mowat returned to Ontario, where he and Fran built a log house at Palgrave, north of Toronto.
We lived in tents up under those trees up there, and dug the basement. It's only under that half kitchen bathroom by hand, and everything has to be done the hard way, and that's what I object to. If there's a hard way or an easy way, this was Angus, you see, do it the hard way.
The writing came the hard way too. Mowat's first stories were rejected by Canadian publishers. And so in 1952, People of the Deer was published in the United States. It caused an uproar in Canada. Harold Horwood was then a parliamentary reporter.
Farley had said that these people, the Ihalmiut, the Caribou Eskimo, he said they were starving, and the opposition, who were delighted, of course, to get a hold of anything like this, kept popping up in the House and asking questions of the minister and the Prime Minister, asking what the government was doing. These people were Canadian citizens, and they were starving, and what was the government going to do about it? And the government kept denying that any such people existed, and they kept denying it for a week or 10 days. And then quite suddenly they announced that they were flying in cargoes of meat to these non-existent Eskimos that Mowat had written about. And they did, in fact.
Quite a debut for a young writer. In one stroke, Mowat had shown why he would go on to sell millions of books.
I think Farley has a wonderful sense of narrative, and he's always combined this with a choice of subjects that touch a large number of people.
He was not only a writer, he was also a prophet. Time and again, Mowat has been ahead of his culture in his concern with native people, with wildlife, with the environment generally. He was outrageous, tactless, uncomfortable, and he knew exactly what he was doing.
The story is a meld of many things. It's a meld of reality, it's a meld of imagination. And that's what a story is, and that's what I am. I'm a saga man. And the story is first and foremost. It must always be. Anything that impinges upon it, that constrains it, constricts it, or changes it, is an abnormality and to be discarded. So if people think that the powers that be say, well, you can't preach and be a writer, I say,
this view of storytelling irked his critics.
they gave me a new nickname immediately. Instead of Farley Mowat, I became known as Hardly Mowat.
Even Mowat's longtime editor has often wrestled with him about the facts and the truth.
Yes, it does bother me. As his editor, of course, I'm always asking these questions. In Sibir at one point, he says that Claire and I were the first people, Westerners, to come to Chukchi for about 50 years or since the revolution. I said, how do you know that? He said, it doesn't matter. Now that's careless, and that I think is that's worth criticism. But if you look at things that he loves, when he writes about things he loves, as in this Rock Within the Sea, and that was praised by historians like Jack Plum.
Controversy brought him fame and made him a target. And the debate over his methods continues.
I think that the most preposterous defense of Farley that's been put forward so far is that his subjects are so vital, so important, that it doesn't matter if he makes up a little bit here or there or fills in with a bit of fiction. I would say that when you're doing a really important subject, it becomes more vital, more crucial that you stick with the facts and make a credible book or article. Because if you're doing things that might affect public policy, you shouldn't put yourself in a position where people can poke holes in your entire argument by simply pointing out that some fact is not a fact.
The facts, the story, the truth. In 1957, one of Mowat's Inwood friends, a woman named Kikik, was charged with murder and criminal negligence. That story made headlines across Canada, but the news stories paid scant attention to Kikik's circumstances and Kikik's culture. Mowat wrote his story several months later. He told about the starving, deranged hunter who had murdered Kikik's husband and threatened her family. Kikik killed him and set out in a blizzard with her 5 children to walk to the nearest trading post. They were starving too. Elizabeth was a baby on Kikik's back. David was old enough to walk. But eventually, to give the others a chance, Kikik had to abandon 2 daughters, including Anakatha, who was 6. Even now, David doesn't want to remember.
I never try to remember anything. All I do is just read it and forget it.
She said she remembers being dragged with her little sister on the skin, and she noticed that the little sister started to sing a little lullaby or something, being a little girl, sing a song. And after she sang a song, she didn't say anything else. Then she knew that she had died.
A song of devotion to a strong, brave mother. Kikik was eventually acquitted, but Kikik's children never knew the story. Hurt and shamed, Kikik kept it from them. 15 years later, they learned the details from Mowat's book.
She's very happy that Farley Mowat wrote about the ordeal of our mother, and because she never mentioned it, nobody ever mentioned it, we would have never known. She would have always wondered what happened. what happened.
For Kikik's children, Mowat's story is the truth. Jack McClelland, publisher. Farley Mowat, author. The exuberant mavericks of mid-century Canadian publishing.
He came to our office. He was then living in Palgrave. But he called me and said he wanted to drop in. And he came in with his red beard. And I can't truthfully remember whether he was wearing a kilt then or not, but he probably was. And to tell you the truth, I was not very impressed by Farley in that first meeting. I thought he was difficult, abrasive, not a writer who I was going to enjoy publishing it.
Jack McClelland's flamboyance transformed Canadian publishing. He staked his company on finding and promoting brilliant Canadian writers. An ardent nationalist, he was Mowat's publisher and buddy. Mowat was becoming a celebrity. He was also a family man with 2 young sons. Sandy, born in 1954, remembers happy times at home when his father was there.
My father wasn't here more than he was here. Now, I would spend time with him in his writing cabin. Obviously, he worked here, so it was perfect because, I mean, either my mother was here to look after me or he was. So I'd often spend hours at a time in the writing cabin trying to amuse myself, I suppose, while he'd be working on whatever book he was working on.
Fran still lives in the log house in Palgrave. Sandy, his wife Kim, and baby Justin live nearby. By the late 1950s, the Mowats' marriage was coming to an end.
I think the two of us were two different types of people. And I know when I wanted to travel, Farley didn't. And when we had children, I couldn't travel with 2 children. It was too much. You know, it was much easier to stay put in one place. And then Farley said, well, you know, go down to Cape Breton or Newfoundland or something. I said, but Farley, for the summer. And I said, but I'll be doing exactly down there what I'm doing here, really. And I would. He'd have an awfully good time, but I'd still have children and meals and everything to get. Laundry to do and everything. And, which I don't think he realized.
Like his own father, Farley sent his sons a rich stream of letters.
They were really quite wonderful letters, but they were very evocative. They were basically stories. So in a way, I was living his life, but through his letters.
The letters often came from Newfoundland, where Mowat's fascination with the traditional seafaring people was producing another series of books. He bought a little schooner to explore the coast. In the French outpost of Saint-Pierre, he met a graphic designer named Claire Wheeler. She soon became a permanent part of the crew.
I had heard of him. You know, I had not read any of his books, but I was on a course to study French, and my colleagues knew who he was, and it was suggested one day that we all just go down and visit him on his boat. So we did. And he was scruffy and messy and dirty, and the boat was disastrous.
The boat was Happy Adventure, the famous boat who wouldn't float.
Rather than the boat who wouldn't float, it should be called the captain who wouldn't sail. Because Farley, if there was any sign of wind, was not keen on going out of harbor.
These various sinkings that happened, every damn one of those was Farley's fault, not the fault of the boat.
I have to tell you that I was scared out of my wits practically the whole time. Being captain of my own ship is the most terrifying thing I can imagine.
Sailing towards Cape Breton, the Mowats put into the outport of Burgeo to wait for a favorable wind.
We were there for 6 years, and I love it still in the same way that I did then. And I feel like somebody's been driven out of paradise, in a way, driven out by my own actions.
The crisis occurred in 1968 when a huge fin whale became trapped in a saltwater pond. Mowat tried desperately to release her and called on the outside world for help. Most villagers supported him, but not all.
There were a number, perhaps only half a dozen, young men in Burgeo who had been away a lot, and they'd become infected with our way of looking at things. And they had access to 303 rifles that belonged to the local, I think they called it a ranger platoon. So these guys thought it would be fun to do some target practice. And they opened up on the whale. By the time we heard about it, maybe the second day after they'd started, we were too far away to hear the shooting, and got down there and got it stopped. The whale had received perhaps 100, 200, who knows, bullets. She was a 60-footer, probably weighed 60 to 70 tons, an enormous creature. The actual bullets would have, unless it'd be almost impossible for them to strike a vital spot. But what happened was that in the next 10 days, while we were trying everything we could think of to free her, but what we didn't know was that the bullets' holes were becoming infected. And after 2 weeks, she died. It was full dark by then, and there was none to know that I was weeping. Not for the whale alone, but because the fragile link between her kind and mine was gone. I wept because I knew that this fleeting opportunity to bridge, no matter how tenuously, the gulf that is increasingly isolating mankind from the totality of life had perished in a welter of human stupidity and ignorance, some part of which was mine.
The media portrayed Burgeo's people as barbarians. They felt betrayed and ostracized Mowat. Again, he became the wanderer, the outcast without a home.
At one point, we owned houses all over the place. Oh, dear. Well, most of them have been sold, and we've moved on and consolidated things. I suppose that is a bit eccentric, owning, at that point, I don't know, about 4 or 5 houses. Some were empty, some had tenants in them, some had just friends who camped in them. I don't know, I've lost track. But I don't know. Well, I guess the fact is we could afford to buy houses. And since neither of us has a clue about investing in, I don't know, bank statements or whatever people invest their money in, it just seemed to us the simple, forthright thing. You own a house, therefore, there it is, made of boards and bricks.
Once he built himself a very grand house in Ontario, but then decided it was they both made them nervous to live in it, so they never lived in it. I thought it was a splendid house, but it wasn't for them.
The Burgeo experience had darkened Mowat's vision and profoundly unsettled him as a writer. Always in the public spotlight, he became almost a caricature of himself. In 7 years, he published no work of importance.
From that point on, largely because of the publicity that generated, and also because I was at a point where I was becoming more aware of everything that was happening in the world, that was when I began to realize that I had really 2 fathers. I had the father who was the private Farley Mowat, and then I had the father who was the Farley Mowat, the crusader, the entertainer.
You were the one who said that he walked through life holding a cardboard cutout of him in front. Yeah, that article you did about 20 years ago. And it's true. He has like an actor. He puts on a sort of mask and a persona.
It was basically protection. It was basically to ensure that nobody really knew who I was or how I felt. I didn't mind if they knew who I was, but I was desperately afraid of people knowing how I felt.
Burgeo had killed the carefree, rum-drinking sailor. Behind the cardboard caricature, Mowat had become deeply pessimistic about human nature. He was evolving into an environmental Jeremiah, a prophet of nature's revenge. Once again, the unhappy Mowat escaped to the animal world. The second great dog in his life was the redoubtable Albert.
This was one of those great companionships. Farley and Albert together were at their heroic best. Albert and Mutt are related in spirit, but I think Albert will turn out to be the more remarkable of the two. Albert is not so much of a comic as Mutt, but Albert is a great, great character.
Albert was a recalcitrant, incredible animal, and I don't want to fool around with him. You know, he scared me in life. He was so sapient, and he really knew me better than I knew myself. And he was, as I say, intractable. I think if I started fooling around with his life story, he would appear in the dark of the night, a great black monster looming out of the darkness, and snap my head off.
In the heart of his personal darkness, Mowat found his voice again. He plunged into the horror of his wartime experience and emerged with a searing memoir. Meanwhile, he had lost both his father Angus and Albert.
Albert and Angus died within a year of one another, maybe even a few months of one another. And it was as though Farley lost some kind of joy from his life at that point, which he never recovered afterwards, never has quite recovered. Because these two outrageous, dominant, controlling, vigorous, colorful creatures had brought meaning to his life.
The son of a sea cook and a cook in a trader. Can dance, I can sing, I can reef the main.
Angus Mowat had been a stimulating father, and Farley cared for him deeply. But the father's obsessions had been a burden to the son.
He wanted to be a novelist. That was his real dream. And he wrote 2 novels, not bad, but not good. And then realized that he was not going to be a novelist. Since he hadn't made it in his own mind as a writer, he hoped, believed, and desperately and dearly desired that I would. But as time went on, and I wrote more and more so-called, quote, unquote, nonfiction books, I sensed a sense of disappointment in him, almost not hostility, but I was letting him down. And that bothered me as well as bothering him. It was something that I would try to alleviate every now and then by writing a novel. And I wrote probably 6 of the worst goddamn novels you ever saw in your bloody life, you know. They're all buried, trying to get rid of the sense of guilt that I wasn't measuring up.
At 70, Angus had left Farley's mother, Helen, for a much younger woman. In Angus's last years, he and Farley didn't see each other often.
The last time I saw him, a few months before he died, there was a kind of pleading in his approach to me. And I suspect now that what he was really saying, and maybe I'm imagining this too, but I think what he was really saying was, forgive me for my demands upon you, for wanting you to be what you could not or would not be. And that's a happy thought.
In recent years, Claire has emerged as a writer herself. She's now working on her 5th book. Today, the Mowats live and work in Port Hope, Ontario during the winter. They spend the summers in River Bourgeois, Cape Breton. River Bourgeois was once a busy fishing port, but now the fish are gone. The Mowats' friends and neighbors, the Twinar family, are growing scallops, trying to put life back into the empty ocean. Here, beside the Atlantic, Mowat set to work on the grimmest of all his books.
His Death of the Whale concentrated my thoughts on what this part of the world had been like before we came along and proceeded to destroy it. And that led me into the investigation. And the investigation became a horror story on a level that I couldn't have believed possible.
Sea of Slaughter tells how rich with life the East Coast waters were before the Europeans came, and how the fish, the birds, and the animals were all but exterminated. It's the culmination of Mowat's voyage into darkness.
The most difficult book I've ever written. I made at least 10 starts on it, and I'd get maybe 2 chapters into it and say, I can't go on with this. I just bloody well can't tolerate it. I can't live with it. And I'd put it aside and go on and write something else. But I was drawn back to it by a sense of puritanical guilt, I guess, My puritanical Protestant preacher ancestors said, you can't drop it, you've got to finish it.
The book took 6 hard years to write.
I went to see him about this time, and I said to him, not feeling very good. I've been depressed, sort of depressed for the last 6 weeks. And he said, 6 weeks? How would you like to be depressed for the last 6 years?
And it was so unrelenting. It was so ferocious. It was so misanthropic. I said, Farley, this is not your gift. You weren't born to be a Jeremiah, unless it was a comic Jeremiah.
There wasn't much room for storytelling. There was so much that had to be said. Occasionally I would try to make a story of it, but it didn't seem right somehow. The reality of the atrocity was so enormous that trying to make a story out of it seemed like demeaning it. I sit at the window of my home beside the Atlantic Ocean. My work is almost done. Having led me through so many dark and bloody chronicles, this book comes to an end. The question with which it began is answered. The living world is dying in our time.
In recent years, Farley Mowat has been summing up, writing autobiography. He remains both a prophet and an activist, supporting the animals and the environment with his name, his time, and his money. But he rarely speaks in public.
It's torture for him to give a speech, for instance. I mean, I learned that. That's one of the things I don't like to ask him to do, is give a speech. Like for Earth Day in 1990, I wanted him to come for the 20th anniversary of Earth Day and speak on Parliament Hill. And he said, I don't do that anymore. I just won't give a speech. It's just torture. I hate it. I said, I don't want you to give a speech. He said, well, what do you? I said, I just want to be able to put on the program that you're coming, and when you get there, if you could just lead us in a wolf howl or something, that'd be good. That's all you have to do.
The message comes from a family of wolves who were destroyed by government biologists flying over in aircraft dropping strychnine baits. The message they send to you is in their voice.
In April 1996, just before his 75th birthday, and just as the latest controversy about his writing erupted, Mowat had a slight stroke. He came to Cape Breton as usual, and by harvest time he had recuperated.
Farley the Bean Slitter. Each time I do this, I think I'm cutting the throat of a literary critic. Makes me feel good for the whole day. Take that, Robert Fulford, I say. Take that! We may have to.
He doesn't have to write anymore.
Things are going.
For 60 years, he's enraged, delighted, and entertained readers around the world.
Having been in publishing since I was young, I thought a lot about one subject, and that is, where would I rank Farley among Canadian writers? And I think, without any doubt, that Farley Mowat is the single greatest writer that Canada has ever known. And I say that, Peter Newman wouldn't like it, Pierre Burton wouldn't like it, many others wouldn't like it, dead or alive. And yet I think he is the most important writer and the best writer that Canada has produced yet. And I don't think there's any question about that.
He works at his own pace, piecing together the saga of another forgotten people. A true story, of course, though some will disagree. Mowat couldn't care less.
I'm past the age where I either enjoy controversy or flinch from it. It really doesn't matter a hell of a lot to me. The story that I'm telling is, I believe, a true story. And it'll be for others to test it, to go out and do the archaeological digs, to do the research which they should have done and didn't, which I've done for them, to test all that stuff out and decide whether I have a valid story or not.
think you should write more children's books so you can get the point across. Keep up the good work.
I think that Farley Mowat probably has a lot of people who hate him all over the world, but I think he probably has a lot more people and kids who really like him and love his books.